Welcome back to Split Picks. If you're here, you probably know that we are talking about Japanese horror this year for our October Horror series. Specifically, we are looking at Japanese horror, and this is part 2 of our episode looking at The Grudge. We just talked about Takashi Shimizu's 2002 film, Ju-on the Grudge. It's a weird franchise where they remade it for America, and that's where we're going next. But before we get there, Japanese horror is a gigantic topic. We're barely scratching the surface. I'm being joined again. Obviously, they're still here. We got from Clockwise, we got Bennett Glace, Frankie Vanaria, and Jim Hickcox.
Clockwise for the listener.
For me, because I'm important, Jim. But I love Japanese horror films, and so I just want to take a moment. Do you want to each throw out one or two that you adore that we won't be covering on this series? Because it's, like I said, it's a giant topic.
Well, for me, Godzilla is very near and dear to my heart because kind of bizarre to think of as a horror movie because Godzilla is not very scary in it, but obviously all of the things that Godzilla represents in the movie and when the movie is made and all of that, I think the playfulness of it, but also the metaphor of it strikes me in a certain way every time, and all the other Godzilla movies are great too. Even the American ones. So.
I think I'll honestly say, and listeners may be wondering, then why is he a guest on this podcast? I think Japanese film in general is a tad bit of a blindside for me. I have seen like 2 films from Akira Kurosawa. I've seen 2 films from Ozu. I really I haven't seen a lot of the heavy hitters, but I have seen a handful of Japanese horror films. A Page of Madness is a great silent film from 1926 that's like really genuinely pretty scary, and it doesn't have the version of it that exists today.
You just Wikipedia'd that right now.
No, I went to my Letterboxd and I went to horror and I sorted by rating, and I was scrolling through and I was like, what are some Japanese horror films that I've logged? Takashi Shimizu himself has a great film called Marabito about
like sewer vampires,
videographer, right? And like a video journalist who investigates like subway and like sewer vampires. And it's pretty scary. I don't know. It's been a while since I saw it. I saw it, I think, in like 2020. But Kwaidan, the anthology film, is great.
Kwaidan's
That's a Criterion
genius.
classic, which also has, I think a guy gets like attacked literally by like corporeal hair at one point, like hair that's alive. I think, or maybe it's just a woman with long hair. The hair.
That might be true. I remember the ears guy mostly.
Oh yeah. It's a country with obviously a long, great history of horror films.
Kwaidan, I'll agree. Kwaidan, I'm going to sign off on Kwaidan being a genius film that everyone should watch. Anyone who knows me, or maybe I don't know, probably no one's listened to enough of these to hear me to know my taste in things. Probably, I don't know if I exist enough in the common sphere for people to know this. But I tend to gravitate towards what I call party horror, right? I'm not that into things that are like just kind of gruesome and upsetting. I'm more into things where there's a lot of colors and then like juices fly out of someone. That's more my speed. So there's a bunch of Japanese movies I love, but the 2 that sort of come to mind immediately that we're not going to be able to cover because they're both by people who didn't make a lot of movies, so there isn't enough to split picks either of them. But one of them is a movie called Survive Style 5+ from the early 2000s. That's also a little bit anthology-ish. It's like kind of 4 stories that sort of tie together, but one of them's like about a guy who keeps murdering his girlfriend, and then she keeps coming back from the dead and feeding him lots of food, and then they fight. It's genius. What part of it is, it's Vinnie Jones of the Guy Ritchie movies is like a assassin who kills people with tiny swords. And one part of it's about like a dad who gets hypnotized into being a chicken, and then he's just a chicken for the rest of it. It's a great movie. And then the other one that comes to mind immediately for me is Wild Zero. I don't know if you guys have seen Wild Zero. It's a zombie alien movie starring Guitar Wolf, the whole band. Guitar Wolf.
Sent that trailer. It looks amazing.
It's incredible. It's also like it has some like politically like pretty progressive for the early 2000s. It deals with some stuff that it just sort of, it's very lightheaded, but it deals with some stuff that it deals with in a really nice way. But mostly it's just like motorcycles and fire and rock and roll and aliens. And the Guitar Wolf the Man cuts a UFO in half with a sword hidden inside of a guitar. It's a great movie.
That sounds fantastic. I got to give two quick titles. I think the first Japanese horror film I ever saw was House.
Yeah, yes.
I don't know if a more fun movie exists than House. I mean, in a nutshell, they were like, I think it was a studio was like, we want to make a competitive, like, Jaws type movie.
Mm.
So essentially, Obayashi was given this big budget, and he was just like, I got you. And he made an insane film. I think it's 6 schoolgirls go to one of their aunt's house, and she's like kind of a witch vampire, but like there's a cat that sings its own theme song. It's so great. But then the other one, Daniel Bromfield wrote about Noroi, The Curse, and it's one of the rare like 2+ hour horror films that is worth the runtime, because it's about a reporter who has kind of like not a lot of leads on something he's tracking down, but then it just gets progressively crazier and crazier, and like he has like just a documentary cameraman following him, and like half the movie is him just turning around like shaking his head to the camera like, what's going on, like why am I doing this? And it's so good. Highly recommend that one. But I do think it's interesting you mentioned Qui-Gon, because I've been reading this book about Japanese horror, and essentially what this book is doing is looking at the J-horror boom, which, you know, obviously was spurred on by The Ring and The Grudge, and how when that happened, especially like American critics and like, you know, foreign critics just started looking at Japan and going, well, where'd the horror come from? Like, it's Qui-Gon, it's, you know, these... what Japan didn't really consider horror at the time. They were more just like, yeah, they're like George Méliès films, but because they have elements of like ghosts and like, oh look, there's like multiple layers of trick photography, like that has to be horror. But essentially that's, I don't know, it's just kind of revisionist history that has stuck, and that is something I wish we had more time to dive into. But anyway, we are back to talk about the U.S. remake of The Grudge, and this is a really fascinating movie for many reasons, but mostly why and how they made it. So before diving into it, Jim.
Hello.
I want to put you on the spot here. So for those of you who don't know, Jim, you are a great filmmaker. I absolutely adore your short film, Slow Creep, and anyone who hasn't seen it, pause this real quick. We're going to be here when you unpause. Give Slow Creep a watch.
It's on the internet.
It's on the internet. But Jim, I only bring this up because I kind of want to get your input on how the trajectory of the Grudge franchise unfolded, because the Grudge did start as a short film.
Sure.
Which then turned into a shot on video film, which then was remade as a feature film, which then was remade by, the U.S. Yeah. So I'm just curious, like, if you're a director and someone's saying, like, hey, I love your short film, let's make something out of this, like, what do you do to turn that into a feature film? And then from there, how would you go about adapting something like Slow Creep to fit another culture as the targeted audience?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question.
It
right?
is.
I mean, it's a little bit different, and this is going to sound very imperialistic, but I don't mean it as personally imperialistic, just like culturally that's the world we live in. It's a little bit different adapting from another culture to America than it is adapting from an American film to another cultural film, because most people in most cultures have seen Hollywood movies, right? So they have a sort of built-in idea of like what's going to play in America, even if that's kooky and wrong. Whereas if it was like, we want you to adapt Slow Creep as a movie for Japan. Well, I feel like I've seen a lot of Japanese movies. I maybe have some guesses. I also, one time at a market, someone was like, I'm looking for movies to distribute in Japan. A Japanese guy told me this. He was like, I'm looking for American movies to distribute in Japan. What you need to be distributed in Japan is bright colors and good music. So like that's my starting point. Okay. But I also think that the stuff that I tend to lean towards would be better in Japan maybe than America anyway. My sort of like aggressive, playful, maximalist, colorful horror stuff. I think that audience tends to. So I think I would love to make a movie for Japan. The other thing is like how much do you take from, because I sort of mentioned this in our previous episode, but it feels like Shimizu is sort of slavish to the ideas he's already had with each new iteration. He doesn't seem like he wants to invent much more, and he doesn't seem like he wants to stray too far from what he's already put on the ground. Whereas for me, I feel like if I'm being asked to go from a short film into particularly the first feature, but even past that, but particularly the first time, I feel like the thing that I want to preserve is tone above all, right? I want to maintain probably aesthetic joy that I found in the short and whatever sort of tonally spoke to me in the short. But like if I was making a slow creep feature, I would change it a ton. I would change it so much. I would keep elements of what I liked about the monster, but some of the things that I liked about the monster in Slow Creep aren't even in the short film. There's a whole scene I had to cut that sort of establishes some rules that don't make it in there. There's a lot. Butoh dancing was one of my main references for the monster in that movie. But you would never know from watching it because the suit was so restrictive that the teenage girl inside of it couldn't. She had very limited motion, and so there's a lot that sort of comes out in production that could be re-examined, certainly. I don't know if that's an appropriate answer.
No, that makes sense. I just like the example of Slow Creep because it has the haunted video, the monster that kind of doesn't really touch people, but, kills them. Yeah.
That certainly, I mean, I don't know how much of the runtime of Slow Creep is you watching the movie that they're watching in Slow Creep. It's probably 25%, right? I would probably ramp that up. I would make that whole movie. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah, I would spend more time with the video. I would make the monster more clear, kind of what it's doing. Spookier.
Okay. So more just rounding out the story is how you'd approach it. And
yeah, I mean, I would do different characters. I would tell a different story, but built around the same concept of a monster.
Well, I bring this up because we're talking about the 2004 Grudge today, and pretty much everywhere you look to read about this film, they call it the first Japanese film made for American audiences.
Weird.
There are infinite implications in that statement, but in a nutshell, essentially, Sam Raimi was a huge fan of the Ju-on films, and he wanted to make a version of this movie for America. So, Jim, you've kind of been selected as our leader for this section. Can you just give us a bit of background into how and why this remake came to be?
I mean, I can give you my impression based on the people involved and the space that it was made in, but it seems like the Ring got made and then got its American remake, and the American remake made a ton of money in a way that the Japanese version simply couldn't because of being in Japanese, right? Because an American audience is tough to crack.
Illiterate.
Yeah, functionally illiterate. They just won't look at subtitles. Which is funny because now everyone has subtitles on for everything all the time. But still feel resistant to watching, at least in my classes, feel resistant to watching things that aren't in English. Very weird.
Yeah, they have subtitles turned on for the language they already are watching the movie and they understand. So it's very strange.
Yeah, they just need reinforcement. It's like they're all learning to read. But right, so some people, it seems, really loved the early films in the franchise, right? The Curse, Ju-on the Curse. And so they were like, this is going to play well. And either, my theory is they sort of made the Japanese theatrical version to get the contract for the American theatrical, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they just wanted to make a Japanese theatrical. And so they did, and then they attracted the interest of American producers, including Sam Raimi. And they made this.
Mm-hmm. So, Frankie Bennett, you two both mentioned you're not too fond of this one. What's going on here, though? Story-wise, how similar is it to the original? Just give me some rough readings on how this film lands with you.
To me, something that we had kind of touched on in the last episode, and I would agree with Jim that and Bennett that the American characters seem largely a contrivance to get American audiences to like the movie, and I think that absolutely is true. Although strange to have a famous actress and a famous actor, and then the other Americans are just like, yeah, that's a nice one. We don't
Kind
care.
of throwaway.
Yeah. Despite that, I think it is kind of interesting. Like adding that obviously international element does add like an interesting wrinkle to it in that, but it like also like we talked about in the last episode, it's another thing where it raises an idea that it doesn't really follow through on, because there's the wife of the guy. She talks about like not knowing the language and feeling like very alienated being in Japan when they have to relocate there for some strange reason for his job, but it's not clear what he does.
Yeah. Something with numbers?
Something with numbers, something with being a number cruncher, which tells you all they really cared about.
Yeah. That's exactly as much as filmmakers know about real jobs.
Exactly. Well, or Jim, fake job.
Sure, yeah.
Being a number cruncher. But yeah, like we were saying last time, it raises like an interesting idea of Japan itself as being like a spectral thing for the American characters, of something they're interacting with without really interacting with it and kind of terrified by, which makes more sense if you're thinking of it as like a haunted house story, that like the city itself is haunted for them. But at the same time, the movie doesn't follow through on any of those things. And yeah.
It does sort of set that up, right? With the thing Bennett mentioned earlier with there's like the Buddhist ritual that they see. And then there's also that sequence where Sarah Michelle Gellar is like lost and like her Japanese is okay, but she's like a little bit scared and a little bit lost. And everyone's like, what's this white lady doing here? It does set that up for sure.
Yeah.
It's funny that her name is Karen.
Yeah, Karen from the Karen Center.
When you watch the movie. And she's, I don't know, like a blonde white lady, getting into trouble abroad. It's a little funny. I'm going to push back a little bit on the slander to the flashback couple. Clea Duvall and Grace Zabriskie aren't quite nobodies.
Sorry, I just need to step on you for 1 second, Bennett. It's the weirdest part about the movie is watching Clea Duvall play an objectively straight woman.
I thought the same thing,
I was
but
like,
also
what
the
are
same
they
thing, her
doing?
husband. William Mapather, it's weird to see him as a guy in a horror movie that stuff happens to. He has such a villainous visage, and he always plays like creepy characters. Like in Lost,
Strange
he's the guy that's like embedded themselves. Like he's the guy from the island, like embedded himself among the survivors. Like he always plays creeps and weirdos. It's very strange to see him as like ostensibly like the protagonist a ancillary protagonist for this sequence of the film.
Also, Ted Raimi's there.
Oh, Ted Raimi's character's name is Alex Jones, by the way. I'm about to take a screenshot of this, and I'm about to tweet, whoa! Like, totally out of context, Ted Raimi is Alex Jones.
That's so
what people
good.
Say. Oh, sorry, one more thing about Ted Raimi's character, and I was actually going to say this toward the end of the last episode. It's interesting. They actually toned down a guy at her work being a creep in the American remake, which I thought would be something that they would tone up. Like, Ted Raimi sort of... you could tell there's a little bit of like, why are you asking, when he asked her like if she's free that afternoon. But it's not like as explicit as in the Japanese version when he's, like full on like asking her to go out. Ted Raimi, great to see him. Apparently, he's wearing the exact same clothes that he was wearing in Spider-Man 2. Someone said on Letterboxd, which is pretty funny.
Cute.
Not to be the CinemaSins guy, and to be fair, I haven't eaten meat in 7 years. But she smells the ramen to identify what flavor it is. Could you smell it as chicken or beef?
In the dry ramen in the grocery store. Like she's never seen ramen in a bowl before, or any kind of noodles in a bowl.
Doesn't it usually have a picture of like the meat that's in it on it?
Yeah.
Like, in my experience, I don't know. I thought that very strange.
So everything about this version is more extreme. Bill Pullman makes a brief cameo to open the film.
I was so excited. It starts with Bill Pullman. I didn't know anything about the movie. I had just written down, whoa, Sam Raimi was involved with this. And then Bill Pullman shows up, and I was like, what a dream, Bill Pullman. And then immediately he jumps off a balcony and explodes on the street. And I was like, oh, okay.
When I saw in the opening credits that he got the with or the and, I figured he was probably going to be like the Drew Barrymore. He was going to get, dispatched pretty quickly. But
sure.
I was very surprised to see him. It's interesting how much more they lean into the hair. Speaking of how much more extreme this movie is, I mean, like I think the credits are like somewhat hair based.
Oh yeah, there's hair,
and then there's a full on like corporeal like hair, just like a hairball sort of like monster at one point, which is very much not the case in the first film. The hair's not even that big in the first film.
There is one scene in the first movie. There's a few where like her head kind of comes.
But it's not,
there's a few where her head kind of comes out of places, but there's one in particular when she's in the bathroom before we get to the like security camera sequence. She's in the bathroom, and as she's leaving, I guess it's Kayako, comes out of the bathroom stall, but it's clearly just like a wig on a stick. The way it moves is so inhuman. I found that one really striking.
Yeah.
It's just hair. It's like the one time in the first movie that I found the hair to be an element. But you're right, in the second one they're like hair, scary hair.
And I mentioned this in the last episode. It seems like a post-Ring thing, how much they leaned into the hair here. And I'm surprised they didn't lean more into like the videotape aesthetic, like creepy, staticky stuff.
Yeah, because it's there. It's there in all of them, right? They all have the security camera sequence.
They could have done. They add obviously too. I think part of adding Sarah Michelle Gellar's character and the sort of like mystery, like figuring it out element is also a little bit more of like a ringification of it.
Sure. I definitely in that sequence, right, with Sarah Michelle Gellar looking at the security camera and the ghost comes right up to the camera and then the whole screen turns black and then the eyeballs open. Love it. I watched this one first, so I was like, yay, delightful. And then they do the same thing in the 2002, and I was like, still delightful. But the first time I thought I was like, oh, is this ghost gonna ring out of this TV? I thought for sure that was what was.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
Because the crawling like that's in the Ring too. This movie is addicted to pairing effective sequences with like following effective sequences immediately with like really hokey bad sequences. Like when Clea Duvall gets killed, or almost like up to basically killed, all but killed. She walks upstairs and the door closes behind her. Creepy, subtle. I imagine that really popped in the movie theater. I imagine that was a real good like jump scare, the door slamming. Good stuff. That's followed immediately by a Toshio jump scare that is so fucking corny. Like I said, I fall for like 90% of jump scares. That's one where I was like, oh, come on, folks. And I don't think this one means for you to laugh with it at all.
No.
I think this one is deadly serious.
Yeah.
And later on, the elevator sequence scare that's borrowed and even made more extreme is then followed by her seeing like a face in the window on the bus, which is incredibly corny. Like, was it the fucking Lion King? Come on.
That scene, it's
terrible,
corny, and then it turns into like a CGI version of Sarah Michelle Gellar reflected in the window. That's way creepier than when it was the ghost. Yeah, it's really unsettling when the ghost leaps. I found.
So I'm going to finish my question here real fast.
Sorry.
So,
no way. You got the Goon Squad.
Like I said, everything in this is just like turned up a notch or three. I mean, like the one that made me just like, really, you're doing that? Is the first time we see Toshio, he's holding the cat and it has two different color eyes. It's like, all right, you're really going for it, aren't you? But they do recreate most of the same scenes. So I'm just curious, how do you feel the style of horror compares to the original version?
It felt mostly the same to me.
It feels almost like a shot-for-shot remake at times.
Yeah.
He really, moves the camera around pretty deliberately. There's a lot of characters in like one half of the frame, a lot of negative space to either side. I think the first kill when like Yoko gets pulled up into like this sort of, I don't know, it's not quite an attic.
The murder attic.
You're really supposed to go up there. The roof crawl space is pretty scary, and I don't really think that's.
Well, that was also
out of the. Is that right out of the
it is out of the first one. Yeah. It just happens way later into a different character.
It's effective as an opening, and it really kind of sets the stakes. And I think it's also in keeping with the kind of extremity. Like it's a pretty jarring. Like, oh, okay, we're not playing
It's also
here.
It put me in a weird place where at the beginning of the movie it's all white people in a place where there's Japanese signage, and I was like, I don't know if we're in like Japantown, Chicago, or if we're in Japan for a minute, and then eventually it became clear that we were in Japan. But then it was like Yoko, that caretaker, right, shows up at the house and is bopping around and like just goes up and like knows that attic door is inside a closet in a bedroom. And I was like, is this a thing that would be normal in Japan, or does she have some secret knowledge of this house? It started off with some things that sort of threw me for a loop as American audience, where I was like, I don't know if this is like standard like if I was walking through an American house and I saw a rectangle in the ceiling with a string with a plastic thing hanging down, I would be like, oh, there's an attic up there. But it was like inside a closet anyway. I was like, is it weird that she knows that this murder attic exists, or would everyone know that it's there? But it is also, yeah, I agree, it's effective. She gets like yanked up into it.
I mean, I agree with Jim, the kind of disorienting part of it. And I think we mentioned this on the last episode or hinted at it, that the city is more part of this movie than I feel like in the first one. And even with Bill Pullman's like suicide at the beginning, there's like a vertiginous aspect to it where it feels like it's more about, that at least introduces like a more disorienting element that I think then complements what Jim is saying.
And imagine if their choice had been, we're just going to have Sarah Michelle Gellar, right? Yeah. She's the American, and she's in Japan, and no one else is a white person who understands and can help her translate cultural elements, right? Then they could have really leaned into that idea of like, there are things that you, the American audience, just aren't going to fully grok. Right.
I was just going to say that I like the Pullman thing too as another example of kind of raising the stakes from the start. Like, it establishes from the beginning that the Grudge it's not just a haunted house movie, right? The curse, can live in other people outside of the.
Did any of you watch this one first?
No.
This movie makes no effort to explain what the Grudge is. I spent half the movie not knowing what the basic premise of the movie was.
Jim, you missed the title card.
No, it's on all the other ones. I don't think it's on this one. Yes, the thing where it's like, is it?
Yeah.
Where it says like, I was looking at the hair. I was looking at the hair.
You were too.
No, that's the 2020. 2020 is where the blood drips down the.
No. This one too. They like highlight the words. The 2020 one is so good. Oh, I can't wait.
I guess I missed that because I didn't understand the fundamental premise for a while. And then again, as I said earlier, or in the last episode, right, it's also, the rules feel like they continually change in all of these movies, where like at first it feels like the house is haunted, and then they're like, but also the ghost can appear wherever, and also it can be anybody, and also it can call you on the phone and appear on your TV, and so it just sort of is constantly shifting under your feet, in a way where I like I don't know if this is like, how many rules are there for a Ju-on in traditional Japanese culture that I simply am unaware of, and how much is the movie just doing whatever it wants to do,
I think where I felt really frustrated with the movie was when they do have that, replay scene of Sarah Michelle Gellar and Bill Pullman being in the room. They're, in different timelines or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that something about that scene, speaking to, I think, what we said a second ago about this being a more serious-minded movie, like, something about that scene registered as very, like, mournful, like, sad to me, and that the original one didn't as much. And I think part of it had to do with exactly the idea that they are Americans who are literally out of place and kind of disembodied in this space. And it annoyed me that there was not a real relationship between, or if there was, I obviously missed it. There was not a relationship between Bill Pullman and Sarah Michelle Gellar, and other than them being American and white people. So I felt like, again, I keep harping on the point that you brought up, Jim, which is that all of these things are introduced and never explored.
Well, it also doesn't, the 2002 one pretty effectively, right? That scene is the parallel to the scene in the first one where the detective sees the 10 years later girls, right? Which is when in that movie it sort of shifts. It shifts from being sort of fragmented into being, for me, like a little sublime in its structure, where you're like, oh, it's shattered time through this space. Whereas in this one, it feels more like there is supposed to be a connection, but you're right, there isn't really. It's the Bill Pullman story is where in this movie you would get that. Also, it's pulling in stuff that's fully disjointed from everything else, but it just doesn't land the feeling that it is fully disjointed. So it ends up feeling more like we're sort of following through Sarah Michelle Gellar's exploration of these ideas, and that's what's cueing us into the other stories, but it just doesn't land as being connected enough or being disjointed enough to be wild.
No, her finding out so much of the whole Bill Pullman story right there at the very end, like from his ghost, like you said, that crossing time thing, like seeing like the past is sublime in the original, and here it's just like what did they have to? Were they rushing to finish the fucking screenplay? Good lord. Speaking of, written by Steven Susko, who would go on to write and direct Unfriended Dark Web, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh.
I do have a question. Is Yoko scares Ted Raimi and I guess then kills him, and she turns around and the jump scare is like her face is like split in half. Is that a new image for this film? I feel like it is.
That's from the short
it's
film.
too?
That's from the short film.
Got it.
The girl with her jaw ripped off.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, the first one, right?
No new images. Once we've made those 2 short films, we're done.
That's interesting.
So the reason I ask about how the style of horror compares is because I watched these 2 back to back, and in doing that, I was shocked by how rushed the American version felt. Like, all of the scary scenes, it seemed like they just took out all of the tension and were like, let's just get to the end of this, okay? Like, it's really scary for us, like, shooting it. Like, let's just get it over with.
Maybe they were scared, yeah.
I know, but, like, I mentioned that
Well, at that point, they know the house is haunted, right? They're like, I don't want to be in this location shooting.
But I mentioned the scene with, when Kayako's in the bed with...
Yeah.
I think it's Rika. No, it's not Rika. It's her sister, I think.
With the sister.
Yeah.
The sister of the husband.
Yes.
Yeah.
They redo that scene, but there's no TV. Like, she literally just gets in bed, and it's like nothing is... There's no, like, okay, maybe things are okay. Like, let's turn on the TV.
It feels even more inexplicable why she would get into her bed.
Right.
She's just received a phone call and hurled her phone into the hallway, and then she's like, "Screw this! I'm getting in my cozy bed."
Yeah, and it's just over. Like, I feel like a lot of this
and then she
film,
just sucked in.
They just kind of rush through a lot of the best parts. Like, I just didn't think the staircase is as scary. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I think something about the way Kayako moves in the first one that's just like, oh, she's like dead and gonna take us all with her. It's just a little too smooth in this one.
It's hard for me because I watched this one first, so I didn't have that context. So for me, everything in it felt... I mean, it did feel fairly flavorless, right?
Yeah.
It felt like it was doing some interesting things, but they're all interesting things that are also done in the first movie, because it's basically the same as the first movie, but with some white people. And in a slightly different order, and minus the sorority girls. That's really the big sadness for me. When I was watching the first one, because I watched that second, I was like, I would edit these 2 movies together and make one better movie, because there's no reason you couldn't. They're shooting the same house.
Stay in the same place. Set in the same place, yeah. I think that, what is the detective talking about, like 3 of his colleagues disappearing? Is that supposed to be like this movie's version of the girls like disappearing, I guess?
Well, no, that happens in the first one too. Oh no, but it happened. He murders them, he like abandons them in the house right after he sees his daughter. There's like 2 other cops that come in, and he's like, "Peace out, assholes," and he runs away, and they get murdered by Kayako.
Just one more, and it's another CinemaSins complaint. I'm sorry. When she's like researching about Bill Pullman, and she finds out that he killed himself, and like finds out like where he lived, the fucking headline is "American Professor Throws Himself Off of Building." Do you think that would be the headline in a fucking newspaper about someone committing suicide? Do you think they'd be a little more delicate than "throws himself off of building"? Excuse me, CinemaSins. Ding. Sorry.
They had a film writer do the headline, I bet. So the biggest difference between the American and Japanese version is the approach to the ghosts. Because Takashi Shimizu has said when he made the original Japanese version, the ghosts were supposed to be kind of harkening back to traditional Japanese ghosts, where they're just kind of, they don't touch you. They're scary. They're in the room. So he calls Japanese horror a more feminine version of horror, where he says the scary part is the impending sense of intangible doom, and it's all about forcing
just
people...
like women.
Well, it's just more about like forcing people to think about negative emotions that are forcing the ghost to haunt. So in a way, it's empathy is involved because you're thinking about the ghost, not... It's not really going to happen in the U.S. But then he says the U.S., it's more about masculine horror, where the ghosts are only scary if they touch, attack, and kill you. It's like, it's very in your face, and, oh, I'm going to grab your leg. What do you feel are some of the major differences between the ghosts in these films, and which do you feel is more effective?
this is, again, an effect of me watching these in inverse order, I think, is that it took me a little while to realize that about the 2002 one. Because in this one, they definitely do a lot of the time. Like I said earlier, it's not very... I know, Bennett, you're saying jump scare a lot. I don't feel like it's very jump scary, this movie. I feel like the ghosts, again, are just kind of present, but not like in a sudden, loud way that they are in a lot of movies, like the 2020. But they do definitely, like, lurch at people and like maybe like shove or like grab a guy and pull him into a tub or whatever, right? They do sort of aggress, is that a word? Where then when I watched the 2002 one later, it took me most of the movie to realize that the ghosts don't, they just kind of show up, and it makes the movie much more cosmic, right? It's much more just about like, you are gonna relive this horror until you die. Right. And not like you're going to be actively smashed into a rock by an assailant that can appear anytime, anywhere, right? To a degree, right? We do see like that sister get yanked down into the bed. We do see like the hand in the hair. There is definitely some aggression in the 2002 one also, but the ending sort of makes it feel, right? Like where it feels like it's just about sort of this personal realization that like, I am going to be haunted by this forever. Therefore, I must die.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we crucially don't see it infecting other people and like leading them to kill other people like we do in the 2020 film, and also The Grudge 2. Spoilers if you guys are interested in watching The Grudge 2. You do see it infecting other people and filling them with murderous rage. I think one of the things this film... Yeah. There's it opens with this. There's like this. There's this couple in it that are like, I think I don't know which of them is. I guess eventually they're both infected with it, and she dumps bacon grease on his head. It's the one image from The Grudge Part 2 that's gonna stick with me. And then she puts the hot pan right on the table. Again, not to be the CinemaSins guy, but come on, good lord. I think the one thing that this movie probably actually does, or in my opinion, does the most effectively of any of them, I do think the creepy crawling is the creepiest in this movie. It's the most reminiscent of like stop motion animation. It's like the creakiest. And that's, I don't know, that's saying something. It's the best I've seen that done, and I've seen it done quite often.
Yeah. Yeah, it does do some where it's like clearly they're playing with like camera speed and stuff. There's like a twitchiness to it. That's nice.
And I imagine if I had seen that in like 2004, well, if I had seen it in 2004 as a 10-year-old, I might have fucking died. But if let's like change the timeline and I'm like 16 and I saw this movie in 2004, I would have been like, whoa,
It's interesting to me because you brought up the fact that the TV is not in it and it's not part of it, and that was I think in the original, what bothered me so much about that moment was that before it like gets all fucked up and like the newscaster is like speaking in gibberish before that happens, like it's a bunch of parts of it are like
it's Japanese, Frankie. It's Japanese.
Okay, all right. Okay, the subtitles are just a bunch of random English.
It might not be Japanese. I don't know.
Won't you look like an asshole? So it's just so strange to me that moment was not in it. But I as like for Americans who love their media so much, but although I didn't find anything scary about either of them really, because I did watch this in the right order. The ghosts this time around just felt like when you see the CGI ghosts, like the spirit.
Again, yeah, both movies, right? There's one big CGI scene, and you're like, why are you doing this?
They really take you out.
Just the American one, especially though, it has no. Craig, I understand entirely about like the more masculine or like aggressive horror component, which is why it is so hilarious that it is the most aggressively CGI and not threatening in any way ghost that it isn't either of the movies.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I mean, like in the first scene, like in the attic, she pokes her head up, and in the Japanese one, she sees the face with the lighter, and she goes, "Oh!" and dies. Like, oh, that was horrifying. I had a heart attack. But this one, it's like the ghost yanks her up, and it's like, okay, you're doing that. All right. I just think this movie's kind of too
I would say being yanked up into an attic is not that different from being yanked down into a bed.
I don't know. It's lame. But this movie just feels so constrained to me, and like the scene where I was like, I really want this to go off the rails is after the sister, she sees the ghost in the office building and it's like, oh, I'm going to run home. I really wanted it to turn into like the first scene of Suspiria there where she opens the door.
It
and
almost
it's just like,
does.
I want like crazy wind blowing.
Aesthetically, it feels like they're absolutely riffing on that scene where she goes out, it's office building, the doors whip open, it's raining, she gets in the cab, we see her in the cab, all of that. I wrote that down. Oh, really? In my brain, it's raining. Because it feels so much like they're doing Suspiria, but they're just not. All of these movies, and I mean no discredit to Shimizu, he's a talented man with a lovely career making movies. But in addition to never really pushing it forward, which I just don't understand, he also doesn't feel like he has any really powerful aesthetic drive. I feel like he has some really nice concepts in all of these, but like the 2002 one, the things that I think make the aesthetics of it creepy are just the cheapness, the items they could afford to use. And then in this movie, it's still kind of shot the same way, but using nicer cameras, and it just ends up aesthetically kind of flavorless, which, I mean, I think all three of these movies are pretty good, and I would recommend any of them to someone who's looking for, I don't know, a Grudge. But, if someone had been pushing a flavor like Suspiria, right? My takeaway note, my final note in my notebook on this one was, this movie is weird, but it would have been better weirder, right? Yeah. It's like,
it's true. Yeah.
The heart of it has some weirdness in it, but it just like doesn't feel like there's the follow through. I also suspect I was like, all of the people who are white their performance is so flat. And I wonder if that's just because he was not super familiar with directing American actors or working with English speakers. But it feels like making Shimizu do the remake might have been a disservice to both him and the film.
Mm-hmm.
I don't disagree.
You should definitely watch The Grudge 2. I think you'll enjoy it. It definitely pushes.
I will.
Farther.
That's my suspicion, is that was the best one.
I mean, it's like you'll probably feel like it's like the 2020 directed by a better director. I mean, it's not as gross as the 2020
sure.
one, but there's this scene where one of the central family's like daughter's friend, she like knocks on her door, and when she answers, the friend is like drinking like a full like carton of milk or like a gallon of milk or like a quart, and then she starts puking it back up into the bottle. It's so fucking gross. And again, that's like an example of like a scene that's going to stick with me. And you can't say not every horror movie has one of those. And The Grudge 2 certainly has one of those. I don't think The Grudge 2004 has one of those. I mean, I think the trailer was honestly more effective than the film, because I'm still thinking about the trailer.
All the most iconic moments in The Grudge 2004 are also in The Grudge 2002, right? We get the hair and the hand and the hair again. We get all the same. They
change the meow in the trailer. In the trailer, I remember the kid opens his mouth and does a pretty like normal like meow.
Does a whale noise.
And in the movie, when he does it in confronting William Mapother, however you pronounce it, it's more of like a screech. So they toned it down for the trailer, if I remember correctly. Now, it has been like 20 years since I saw the trailer, so who knows? But
so, Jim, I'm glad you mentioned your final note on the page, because I will be completely honest. Watching it this time, I fell asleep, and the final note I had just says, bus scene, Kayako in window, bad, does not improve. So
you should watch the next 8 seconds, because when it turns back into Sarah Michelle Gellar, it's spooky.
Oh, I saw it. I fell asleep after that part. But I think this will probably be the last question to close out this section, because this will transition into the next film. So one of the studio's goals with this version is they wanted to make sure they hit a PG-13 rating.
Ooh.
I mean, PG-13 horror films, and really comedies too, they just seem to be rarer these days. So I'm just wondering what you all think, aiming for a specific rating. What does that do for the constraints of making a film, and is it for better or worse?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think a film necessarily has to be like really like gory or full of like nudity or anything to be any good. But
disagree.
It's never a good. It's never. Yeah, I mean, it always helps, right? And it's never a good thing when there's like a a wall around like what a movie can feature. Particularly if it's a horror movie or a comedy, right? Things that you want to be kind of extreme.
I mean, I'm broadly against the MPAA. I don't.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I don't like that we force movies to be rated in order to play in most theaters. I think that it is broadly a destructive force. But also, like, PG-13, you can still do most stuff.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's great PG-13 horror movies, of course. I mean, I don't know. M. Night Shyamalan has gone really far with PG-13 ratings. Like, Old is PG-13.
Ooh, like Scary Trees.
Well, all right. I mean, like, you know, The Happening is a great movie, by the way. That was his first R-rated movie, I'll have you know. So why don't you... I did my research. Why don't you do yours, all right?
I grew up in the era of difficult PGs, right? I mean, PG-13 was invented when I was a young boy.
Because of the difficult PGs, right?
Yeah, but there was still a lot of, like, all the VHS tapes I was getting when I was a kid were PG, but, like, on the rough side of PG. And I think that is such a beautiful space. That's where I would live there forever if I could. So for me, I don't know, PG-13 constraints feels like a great way to push what you can show to a child to the max.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like there is a real contradiction with what Shimizu thought the American intention for, like, horror or ghost story was, and his kind of, I guess, native appreciation for ghosts, because you could do that more feminine, empathetic, and, like, that would be appropriate for PG-13 to just, like Jim was saying, have a character in a room just staring at you, and that's all you don't need or much, you know, the implied violence or, you know, terror or empathy. All of that is more artistically interesting than, you know, the more in the jump scare aggressive kind of territory. Or, you know, not that this movie is very scary or violent or gory or any of that, but it's trying to be, or, you know, it has more of that maybe than the original.
Yeah, I wonder if do you think that was just a perception he had about America and that he leaned into when he was making? Or do you think Sam Raimi or one of the other producers was like, we want you to remake this movie, but for America, the ghosts have to strangle people?
I think that was a big part of it. Yeah.
That's too bad, because if it were a more direct remake, right? If it were pretty much just the 2002 movie, but with a nicer camera and in English, I think it would probably... I mean, I want to say do better or have done better, but I guess it did really well because they, you know, it made a ton of money. But
apparently they announced the sequel like the same weekend, like
sure.
The Sunday of the opening weekend. They were like, we're doing The Grudge too.
Well, it was also probably incredibly cheap.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it cost like $30-40 million or something.
Yeah, oh, really?
I think it might have made its budget in like the opening weekend. Let's see.
It made a lot.
That's more than I would have guessed.
No, $10 million. Hey.
That's what I would have guessed.
Yeah.
It also, I'm sure, was fast. You know, fast and cheap to shoot. So, yeah,
they'd made it before.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they'd already done the whole thing.
A funny thing about the second one is that it weirdly has the most. I've compared. I compared I think the music and the original to Masters of Horror. The second one, I swear to God, has like the same fucking opening credit sequence as Master of Horror with like the dripping blood. It's very hokey. It's funny. The best film in the series has arguably the worst, or, you know, the best film in the original series has undoubtedly the worst opening credits. And that's saying something, because the hair credits stink.
Pretty terrible.
Pretty bad.
They're fucking bad. What is this, fucking Spider-Man? Like, cut it out. The Sam Raimi connection. It is basically the same fucking thing. It's like the web thing. Honestly, that was it. They were probably like, we got to use this web animation again. Make these webs black. We're doing hair. Yeah.
So I want to throw one last quote at you here, because I thought this was just kind of fascinating. So when Takashi Shimizu was approached about doing the remake, he said... This is a quote here. He says, "When I first got the offer to direct the remake, I didn't want to do it because I didn't understand why they wanted to use the same director. But if he said, but if I could use the same characters of Kayako and Toshio for the remake, I would do it because, in my opinion, I can only make dark-haired Japanese women scary, not American women. The studio was fine with that." So
okay, weird.
I just kind of like that. I think we are probably going to keep talking about this Grudge, so I'm going to suggest we pivot into the 2020 Grudge. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
Part of the reason I ask about the ratings for the previous Grudge, where they aim for the PG-13, is because from what I read, one of the guiding reasons for making this 2020 version is they really wanted an R-rated Grudge. This is something Sam Raimi Sam Raimi.
Who ordered this?
They had a script in the works, and I guess when Nicholas Pesh came in and started talking with them about another project, he mentioned, I'm such a big fan of The Grudge. And they were like, we're actually working on another Grudge right now. And so he started talking about, I think if I were to make a Grudge, I'd kind of harken back to the more episodic approach where it's more of an anthology film. And they let him do it. And
that makes me really curious about what they were writing if it wasn't going to be kind of episodic-y. Because that sounds like not a Grudge film.
I don't know if I want to know. So it seems like with any horror film, when there's success, it's just bound for enfranchisement. I mean, I think it's natural for a director to start thinking about what the franchise may become. And Takashi Shimizu said in early interviews that his idea for keeping The Grudge alive as a franchise would be to move the curse to different parts of the world. This is essentially what the 2020 Grudge does. It's about the curse making its way to the U.S. and it finds a home. Although Shimizu is not involved in the film, it is again produced by Sam Raimi. Bennett, you've kind of already introduced us to this film, so I think my first question for you is, you gave this 4 stars on Letterboxd.
Wait, out of how many?
5. What stands out to you about this film, and what led you to rate it the highest of all 3?
Yeah, I think this is the only of the Grudge films you would say has good acting. I think this is the only of the Grudge films that you would say is at all aesthetically distinctive. I think this is, it's the grimmest, and that's kind of saying something, of the franchise. It's the grossest. I don't know, it's the first one of these to really kind of feel like it was taking the sort of curse in all the directions it could take it. Like, even though it's staying situated more or less within one house, we kind of see it, that we see the haunting take on a kind of a lot of different forms, and there are a lot of different types of kills. Call it the prestige TV-ification of The Grudge, but I really think the episodic, the stories are weaved together in like a fun way. It really feels like Andrea Riseborough is sort of solving a crime across like place and time, and
she's the cop.
The Muldoon. I think she's the sort of primary character, the one we kind of not the one we begin on, the one we end on.
And begin on.
Well, I think technically the first person we see is Fiona, the nurse who kind of precedes Yoko.
Oh, right,
in Japan. Right. So I give you a sense, for the sake of the listener, let me give you a sense of kind of how this movie relates to Shimizu's pair of films. So this is set in like 04, 05, 06 in small town Pennsylvania. So it kind of both begins and kind of happens during and after the pair of Sarah Michelle Gellar films. We open on like a nurse coming out of the house, and she's talking to the phone. She's leaving a message for Yoko. The nurse will obviously see get killed there, saying like it sounds like something's off. She's like, I need to go back to my family. There's a great jump scare of like a hand jumping out of the garbage, and she comes back and of course kills her family. So like in The Grudge 2, we're seeing The Grudge kind of infect people and lead them to kind of murderous violence. And it's interesting to see someone like experiment with it. It suggests. Not that I'm a big fan of franchise filmmaking, it suggests a world in which there is, like a Grudge series of films where like different auteurs, step up to the plate. Nicholas Pesh is a guy, I don't know if either of you are familiar with his other 2 films, no. Eyes of My Mother and Piercing. They're both not A24 movies, but you would kind of think they were, because they're sort of like, shoot me, they're kind of elevated horror.
I remember seeing posters and stuff for Eyes of My Mother. I remember hearing people talk about it, but I never saw it.
It's like polarizing, some people think it's like style over substance in a bad way. I think I gave it like a 3 stars on Letterboxd. It's a real.
Would you say this is his best movie?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Okay. With a bullet. Yes.
Great. Then I won't bother.
This movie, one of the things too that I think one of my favorite things about it, like I talked about, is its grossness, how like mean spirited it is. The film really is not afraid to swing pretty wildly in not necessarily in tone, but in like sentiment. There's a scene where a couple that lives in the haunted house. It's a husband and wife. They've been married for almost 50 years. She's got dementia, and he's Jackie Weaver is there to help her like commit assisted suicide. And she is like, your house is haunted, you gotta get the fuck out of here. And he's like, oh, I know, I kind of like it. It's like comforting, it makes me think that maybe she'll be around. But we go right from that like sentimental scene to like Jackie Weaver getting in like a horrible car accident and like her arm like coming off. I don't know. I like that it's a movie that does it's not afraid to kind of swing between those things. That's, I don't know. It's in keeping with the increasingly bad-natured, mean-spirited, sort of twisted nature of it.
I loved that.
Very post-Saw touch, I might say. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I loved that sequence. I loved that it went in that direction of exploring other meanings the haunted house might have for people.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
It does feel like it would have been more powerful in a movie that operated like the first one, where the ghosts are just there, right? Mm-hmm. Where they're not like actively trying to murder you. Where he could have been like, no, look, these ghosts are just kind of around. I wish my wife would just be around after she dies. Right? I do love that it went there. I thought that was really nice.
Yeah, that is something none of the others do. Yeah.
Unconvinced, Craig.
I really am not a fan of this one. What can I say?
That's so funny. For the first 2/3 of the movie, I was like, this remake gets it. I was like, the things that the first remake did wrong, this one is doing right. It understands how to make this movie. It felt like it's doing different stories, but they were all still kind of the same stories with different actors, which I didn't 100% love. It also, the way it's strung together is very much about... It doesn't feel so much like fractured time and stories like the first one. It feels like we're learning things as the cop learns things, Muldoon learns things. It feels like we're seeing it all through her eyes, which I also didn't love. And then at the end, I was like, oh, this movie is like going out of its way to be terrible. It felt like it was making really, really bad choices at the... Also, the way it delivers information, the whole movie is stupid. It felt like it was written by a dum-dum.
No, I like that. I like that we have the other cop like investigating it. I like that this is the first movie where someone actually says Grudge. I like some kind of grudge.
I like that he said Grudge.
I think but like, came back from Japan.
That other cop who shows up and he's like, oh, he never went in the house, never seen a cop do that before. And you're like, that's just exposition. That's not a normal human conversation. It's purely there for me. I don't like that. But I do agree. I do also agree with what you said, Bennett, about aesthetically. It's like, it's not trying anything, but it's doing something, right? It's like, it's not doing anything new.
There's a nice burnish on it. I don't know. The shots look nice, I think.
There were a lot of shots that I liked looking at.
Yeah, it's not a carbon copy of a film that came 2 years before it. It's nice and different. And again, like I said, the image, there's some images that'll stick with you. I mean, I think the other films, at least the 2002 film can say that. I don't think the 2004 one can really say that. This one, Lin Shaye cutting her fingers off. That's a fucking bananas image.
But also one that I've seen before, right? It's not like a brand new image.
I don't know if I've ever seen someone cut their own fingers off in a movie.
Oh, really?
Maybe not that methodically, but...
But I liked it. I thought it was grimy. The movie's grimy.
Yeah, Jim, I'm going to side with you. I'm going to say this movie lost me way earlier than it lost you, though. I'm going to say it was the opening credits for me. When they do the, like, oh, here's the, the curse. They all open with the same thing. But this one just felt like they were like, how do we make a movie scary? Boo. And it's just like a little
creepy imagery that's really vague.
It's awful.
That's credits.
It feels a little outdated in that respect. It feels very mid-aughts. Like, it feels like Monster Energy.
I think that's intentional, right? Because the end, we get to the end
in like 04, 05, 06. It's set in 05. That's why it has that shitty like butt rock over some of the scenes.
We get to the end credits, and it's like Crazy Town or something playing over the end credits. It's very much centering itself in the.
This is a period 2000s. Piece, Craig, and I don't think you're giving it respect for really kind of nailing the feel.
That's the kind of stuff that people say is good about movies like that Ty West movie about pizza. People love his approach to being like, ooh, the credits kind of feel like they're from this era, but they're super digital, so they don't actually feel like it. And everyone's like, oh, you're so smart. This movie's doing the same thing. It's just doing it for 2006.
And it's doing it better. This is a better movie than the Pizza movie.
And more aesthetically correct. It feels more like 2006 than Pizza movie feels like 1970s.
Maybe I'm being a little too harsh to judge a movie by the credits, but I'll go all the way to the first scene when they have Kayako in a garbage bag and she grabs her ankle. That was so stupid.
I liked the breathing garbage bag.
Yeah, sure, but...
When Jackie Weaver's at the grocery store and all the meat's like rotten and all the flies are on the meat, come on, that was scary. Wasn't that a little scary? Face? Oh, the offal, come on. Is it awful or offal? Offal?
I thought it was awful.
Awful?
I am not a huge fan of modern horror in general because I think it's just like a competition to be like, ooh, my movie's scary. Like,
And you know who wins? You know who wins? We do.
Bennett Glace.
You know what didn't make any sense in this movie? This is a thing that doesn't make any sense to me. How come the movie's in 2004, 5, 6, every main character drives a super well-preserved car from the 70s or 80s?
This movie did seem like it was trying to, like go for sort of...
What are they all, wealthy?
Like that period look.
But everyone else drives a car that's just of the period. It's like The Love Witch. Did you guys ever watch The Love Witch?
Frankie
where you're like,
wrote
all
about
the
it,
main
yeah.
characters are living in the 1960s, but everyone in the background is living in 2007 or something. And you're like, what is this movie trying to do aesthetically?
But that one at least does it well.
I disagree.
I like The Love Witch.
It does it in an incredibly confusing way.
Of Tooth will know that I famously loved and have written about The Love Witch for Split Tooth. So
October Horror Year 1.
Right. I agree with you. I happen to think that's one of the virtues of Gellar as a filmmaker, is that the time periods for all of her films just feel so fucking weird. And,
It doesn't feel weird to me. It just feels like the main characters fetishize an era. They all find each other because they're all like, you also fetishize, which I know people like that. I know people who dress like it's 1975, and they meet other people who dress like it's 1975, and they fall in love, right? I've seen it, but it just feels like a movie about a subculture in the same way that Spring Breakers is.
I'm gonna start dressing like it's 2004. I'm gonna get back into Abercrombie and Fitch, I think.
well, that was going to be my question as somebody who has not seen this movie, and I will not, but to even things
Oh, come on. It's
Bennett,
like 94 minutes of your life.
to even things out, I'm going to side with you and say that I liked it.
It sounds good, right? I'm making a case for it. Come on.
And,
Don't you want to see Lynn Shay cut her fingers off? Don't you want to see Frankie Faison's rotting corpse? Come on.
I was going to ask you guys that if you found there was any reason to it being set when it was set, other than to be contemporaneous with.
I think it's just to start as a prequel to...
just so they can make it kind of
like
an immediate prequel sequel. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Frank, I don't know if you missed this, but a character literally leaves the house in 2004 and flies to the U.S. It's like, for a movie made in 2020, it's like, oh, it's a virus film too, kind of.
No, that's funny. I didn't think about that.
But, so, Bennett, maybe I'm a little harsh to judge it by the credits and the first scene. In the second scene, the first time we meet Detective Muldoon, again, it's just like it's attempting elevated horror in that way that's like every character is going to be traumatized.
Sure.
My main takeaway from this film is just a sweeping overall generalization that I think holds a bit of merit, but it's just so much about how horror has shifted to no longer just being about like unsuspecting teens on a road trip who encounter evil, and like these films start out fun and then it's like, oh no, here's Leatherface, like stuff like that. This movie, we have a couple who's debating whether they should abort their baby that may have a rare disease. We have a husband and wife. The wife has dementia and he's trying to humanely end her life. The star detective is a single mother whose husband just died of cancer. We have a detective who unsuccessfully shoots himself in the face and then gouges out his own eyeballs because he's so terrified by what he's seen. If you've ever seen an A24 film, like these are just like omnipresent themes. I mean, why do you feel trauma has become such a crutch for modern horror films?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's anything new. I mean, I think in the Grudge 2, which is only, I think, made in like 2006, just to give you like a very, very brief overview of like, how we wind up back there. Amber Tamblyn is like Sarah Michelle Gellar's sister, and she has like a really terrible relationship with her mother, who is, I think, implied as dying of cancer. And she is like sent to go, pick up Sarah Michelle Gellar and like bring her back. And there's quite a lot of agita. There's a lot of like implied sort of like, oh, you never do anything right. So I don't know that like, tacking on a little bit of like tragic backstory or, Well, I don't know that that's anything new. I feel like it's always been kind of an easy screenwritery trick to make us, care about a character more. And, a movie that does as many things well as this one does, I'm not going to fault for some of its hacky shortcuts,
I'm going to side with what Bennett said earlier, which is this movie, it does have those things. It does put those things there, but it doesn't do like a Hereditary 20-minute long breakdown in the middle of the movie where we're just talking about how the whole movie's about trauma.
Yeah.
It's
and
not
the ghost doesn't take the form of her dead husband or anything like that.
It doesn't go way out of its way to be like, look what I'm about, right? It puts it there, but it doesn't really... It doesn't go into it as much as it could have.
And I don't know. I think that, to me, that's in keeping with the sort of tonal whiplash of the film that I described. Its sort of willingness to go from kind of sentiment to grotesquerie. I feel like giving it that kind of respectable sort of melodramatic window dressing, and then having people's fucking arms flying off, and people shitting themselves and whatever like that. There's something sort of radical in that juxtaposition. I'm making myself laugh here. I'm sorry.
I think I have some insight on why.
I don't think anyone shits themselves. I'm sorry.
What's that?
Cult. I did halfway through the movie. Unrelated to the film, it just happened. I was like, and then it happened. I think I have some insight on why culturally it's happening, right? Is smart people ruin all art because they want to, because here's the thing, sorry, stop me whenever you want me to stop. I have a lot of feelings about this.
That's why I ask.
Art is meant to be a thing that you experience, and it causes you to feel things, right? But smart people want art to tell them things, right? We live in Banksy's world now, where in order for a thing to have value, it has to have a super overt cultural message. It's not only just a thing that audiences presumably want, it's a thing producers want. It is how all of the indie film world operates. It's how you get funding. It's how you get into Sundance Labs. It's how any grant you're applying for asks you, even genre films, I know this, even genre film grants ask you to justify why your film is gonna matter. As if you could make an art that doesn't matter, right? As if you could make something that is effective and makes your audience scared and makes them feel something, makes them poop their pants, but it's not overtly social enough, so it shouldn't exist. That's the world we live in right now. So it's because people want to be able to watch a horror movie and be like, but still be like, I'm too smart for trash. Which is, it's inane. But that is the world we live in right now, is that in order to make any movie, unless you can fund it yourself, right? The movies that are not trying to hammer a message into you are getting cheaper and cheaper, because there just isn't a machine that's interested really in producing things unless they can justify themselves somehow, which is fundamentally missing the point of what art is, I think.
Yeah, no, Jim, I totally agree with you, but I bring this up in part because I remember last year, I think it was the Sergio Martino episode, we had talked about, the Italians were a lot of guys who didn't go to art school. They didn't go to film school to learn how to make a shot. They learned by doing it. It's like, how do I do this shot? I don't know. What if we build something that'll help? Oh, okay, sure. And then it's like, oh yeah, they found a way. I feel like this movie is just so textbook. Okay, we're gonna have a downtrodden character who has a deep love for a child, but also the child's gonna turn into a ghost. It's just you hit every expected beat. And Bennett, maybe this should go back to you here because I'm kind of harping on the film, but I just feel like every character was just so predictably this is their form of trauma, that there's really nothing to grasp onto on these characters.
They're not really characters.
Yeah, they're pretty blank. But in understanding comics, Scott McCloud talks about the concept of masking. You draw a character with sort of non-distinct features. It's easier to imagine. It's easier to map oneself onto them, right? So maybe that's a little of what's going on here. Maybe these are these are non-distinct characters, so we can imagine it happening to ourselves.
I always bring that up in my film classes as a justification for why I think we're always casting like white guys who look kind of just like
kind of basically the same,
Blansom, right? They're all we're just like, this feels like the most neutral for an American audience. It's just kind of handsome white guy who you wouldn't pick out of a lineup. It's because of that, Scott McCloud.
You can't be too irregular looking and open a movie anymore. I don't think you got to be named Chris and pretty bland. Yeah.
In the first scene where we see that cop, her kid is scared. His dad just died 3 months ago, and she kneels down next to the bed and to comfort him says, well, nothing bad's going to happen to me. Which is completely, again, I think this movie was written by a dum-dum. Completely insane. Also, she's a cop, and she's like, what do we do when we're scared? We close our eyes and count to 5. Any dangerous scenario that a cop is thinking about is a dangerous scenario where closing your eyes is a bad idea.
I like that some of the again, to this movie feeling a little bit like outdated. I like that some of the details really feel like something that would happen in like a really like gritty, like graphic novel.
Like it could have been
the
Frank
guy
Miller.
like shooting himself in the head and like surviving, you know, and having that like horrible like disfigurement. Like that feels like something that would happen in like a Mark Millar comic or something. Like something, you know, like a sub Frank Miller sort of a thing. Like that, there's a character in Preacher, I think, who has something similar happen, who has like horrible like facial disfigurement from like surviving a suicide attempt. That feels like something out of that. So do so many of the details, so many like the grotesque little details. And I don't know, for as indistinct and as, you know, by the books and like stock, you know, prestige TV character, all of the you know, the people in the film are, I don't know, they're all mostly like overqualified actors turning in like capable performances. And then I don't know, I think that the film moves pretty well from like really gross set piece to really gross set piece. It's not quite as like episodic as the other films. It's more like weaving together kind of a series of narratives. I don't know, it's not perfect, but it's 4 stars out of 5. It's pretty close to perfect. It's, you know, that is not equal to an 80 for me, by the way. That's really anywhere in the ballpark. It could be anywhere in the ballpark of like, you know, 80 to, I don't know, like 93. That's like you could be an A minus. Yeah.
Speaking of, I think, good things from the movie, I think I want John Cho to comfort me with when my nose is bleeding. That's
John
thing
Cho gives a great performance.
I want him to come take
movie.
care of me. That was nice. Yeah, I was so happy to see him.
Having the shower scene, having a man in the classic shower scene, that's kind of a subversion. Come on.
Sure. I mean, I saw it
2020,
coming,
folks.
but sure.
That's I mean. I don't know. I the fact that this movie came out in that sort of like cursed like pre-pandemic sort of winter, I don't know, makes it feel appropriately like grim and like portentous. I don't know. I kind of like that.
So I think my last, like, I'm an old man shaking a fist at the sky about this movie. I think part of it just like it's hard to latch onto characters in this. I mentioned that. My question is, why can't horror laugh anymore?
I have a lot of theories about how you can kind of track the near future of movies by looking at what the WWE is doing, because it taps into similar cultural impulses, but it moves faster, right? Because it's just constantly happening, and I think you can sort of track this like Attitude Era shifting into like more modern wrestling where wrestlers are no longer supernatural creatures, they're just people, sort of just presages like The Dark Knight and stuff. But I think we're still sort of living in the echoes of that, of the early 2000s, sort of like, we need stuff to be super, I guess it's post 9/11, right? Where we're just like, we need stuff to be grim now. There's like, there just isn't...
Joker.
Well, pre-Joker.
Yeah.
There's
it's Joker for The Dark Knight, you know.
Oh, sure. Yeah. There's just like no room for like levity. I think people don't think that people want to have flights of fancy anymore. They want things to just be like so real. It's also.
Can I say something maybe controversial?
Always.
No, I don't believe you can.
I fucking hate horror comedies. I really can think of, I could probably name the ones I like on like one hand. Honestly, like I think like the Motor Media movies are like the only horror comedies that I like. I really.
Well, what do you qualify as a horror comedy though? Like, have you watched like From Beyond?
I wouldn't call that a horror comedy.
I wouldn't call it a horror comedy
either. It's a
either.
funny horror movie, yeah.
But it laughs.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, stuff that's like slapsticky or stuff that's really like excessively tongue-in-cheek.
Sure. That's a different world, though. I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Craig. I feel like what Craig is talking about is like there used to be a whole world of horror that involved like street trash. The kind of shit that I'm excited about is what I'm thinking.
Come on, there is one funny
society,
joke in this movie
right?
I'm not talking about Tucker and Dale versus evil. I'm talking more about how just like films had a sense of humor, and even in like I go to the Italians a lot because it's like so many of their kills are just like, what's the most gruesome thing we can do? And it's like, oh my god, they just did that.
I feel like it does go back to something that Jim had pointed to before with like smart people being in charge, because like I think a related thing to that is people don't want to be seen as not taking violence seriously.
Right. Yeah.
Not necessarily even from like a canceled standpoint, but like not be thinking about the consequences of like their images, which, I guess I could understand that a little bit, but you can still be thinking about the consequences of your, like, as Jim said, art is supposed to produce a reaction in the audience, and there's no rule that says laughing at something doesn't mean you're all not giving it thought. And I feel like it's also, I mean, maybe this is extrapolating too much, but the trauma thing in movies feels so parallel to TV being on the rise, and prestige TV is all dramas, and the idea that everything has to be serious, and there's humor is gone kind of idea is something that TV sort of invented. And despite me hating TV and only thinking of TV as sitcoms, like that's all I understand it as, but that's not what most people or what most Americans or people who make movies and entertainment think of it as. So I don't know, but it's annoying. Although I find like Freddy versus Jason like an annoying movie to watch, it's more fun to watch than Hereditary.
Sure. Let me just loop back. First of all, wait, I have two things. One, Frankie agreeing with me is the most justified I've ever felt in anything I've ever said. I feel the smartest I've ever been right now. Also, the reason I brought up the WWE earlier is because if we look at the state of professional wrestling right now, I feel like we're at the beginning of a pivot to bring levity and absurdity back and flights of fancy. I think we are on our way. I think it's a little bit different. It's a little more Orange Cassidy now. For anyone who knows what that means, I think we're moving in what I feel to be a positive direction. I hope.
That's good. I feel like Twitter dying has definitely changed things.
Sure. Yeah.
Bennett, I'm gonna return it to a happy place for you. I gotta say, the end of this movie when she's in the house, like getting ready to burn it down, that totally reminded me of the Haunted Mansion. Was that just like a happy place for you?
No, to be honest, I only watched The Haunted Mansion once. I don't know if I remember the plot all that well. Did they burn the?
Well, no, just with
Eddie
the
Murphy just burns
everywhere.
houses
Just
down.
like I'm talking about like the actual ride, like,
where it's like I want to show you something.
Yeah,
I want to show you something.
I don't know. It's pretty par for the course with this series, at least in the American takes in this series.
Just written dumber. It's like the same idea, but written dumber.
Now, let's agree to disagree. I don't know. I kind of admire how I actually think it's a bit of an anachronism how like totally humorless this movie is, because even stuff like Hereditary that's like trauma porn, I think, I don't know, gets credit that it probably doesn't deserve for being like darkly comic. And I don't know, I remember laughing at stuff in Hereditary. There's a part in Hereditary when he's like in the high school class and his friend his friend sends him a text message and he turns around and his friend's going like this. Like that's kind of funny. Like that's a moment of levity in a pretty good
everything
movie.
With the little sister in that movie is funny.
Yeah, there's almost no humor in The Grudge, but I do think the bit when Damien Bachir's character has the two like DVDs and he's like, you can watch 48 hours.
That was super fun.
Having just watched 48 Hours pretty recently, holy moly, I literally don't think there's a movie with more racial slurs in it. The only two movies they have are cop movies, right? They're like, we have 48 Hours in the French Connection. Yeah. I do think the very ending of this film is incredibly effective. I like how like grim it is. Andrea, I probably said the word grim 100 times. I really apologize. Andrea Riseborough getting kind of like dragged to her doom. It's very Saw, very like someone like screaming in the sort of like Saw trap room.
They 100% missed the chance to have her burn her own son to death. They walked right up to it and then didn't do
why
it.
They didn't do that.
I don't see why they didn't do it. You want to build your movie around trauma. You want to have the reveal at the end that she has the wrong boy. You don't even have to show it, right? We just see her do the thing, and then she cuts to her house, and then the ending's the same, but without the extra boy in the background. And you're like, oh no, she burned her son to death. Also, what I do like about the ending is that it confirms that burning the house down doesn't help.
Yeah, I like that. Because I hate that
unclear
news. I hate that as a fucking answer.
Yeah.
It's so easy. Come on.
Yeah, too easy. So we're like, oh, great. So there's no cure for the grudge, and grudges can happen anywhere now. That's nice. But it does feel like, to me, it feels like the 2002 movie has so much ripeness in it, has so much you could grab onto. And the 2004 remake gets a little bit of it, but really misses. And the 2020 remake, for me, also gets elements of it, but really misses on other elements. So for both of them, it felt like the filmmakers were like going out of their way to make worse movies than they could have. It feels like such fertile ground to me. It feels like you could make such an incredible American remake of this. And I just don't know why. It feels so easy to not make it worse than it has to be.
Yeah. You might say that this premise is fertile ground where Nicholas Pesh planted a beautiful sunflower for all of us to admire.
Let's tie this all together. Normally we do a pick where we pick one movie, but I'm intrigued. Let's power rank these. Bennett, why don't we get you to go first, because I think your answer is the most blatant. How do you rank these three films, 1 through 3?
So I would say, the 2021 is number 1 with a bullet. I would say The Grudge 2, if we're counting that, is the second best. Then I would say, the original 2002 film. Then I would, of course, say the 04 remake. I think is, again, I don't think it's like way weaker than the original, but I don't know why remake your film but worse.
Okay. Frankie, how about you? You have not seen the 2020 Grudge, so you are excluded from that, but I think I know where you're going to put it.
Oh yeah, it's at the top. It's better. But serious, I do think that actually the American one is the Grudge, the 2004 one is higher for me than the original, just because that explicitly international element adds more interesting stuff that the original one has interesting stuff with what the ghost means, but it has that and some more with the American one. And so that one for me. Well, I guess 2020 is one for me than 2002.
All right. Jim, how about you?
I put them all on about even footing. I feel like the first one gets credit for being the first one, right? Like that's worth something for it, even though it's actually the 5th if you count the shorts and the 3rd if you don't count the shorts. But for me, all 3 of them have some really vital ideas, and all 3 of them sort of explore kind of different things. Elements of the same idea kind of happenstantially, and all 3 of them kind of miss the mark in different ways. I think they're all kind of fun, and they all have that same like kind of the same heart of the idea of the Grudge, but I don't think any of them explores it in the way that I want to see it explored. So if somebody was like, Jim, I'm up, I want to watch one of the first Grudges, which one would you say? I mean, I would say I have really high hopes for the American Grudge 2. Maybe try that one first. But like in terms of the other 3, it kind of feels like a toss-up to me.
Okay. I got to go chronologically with these. I think they get progressively worse, and the drop-off is steep. Yeah. I really enjoy the 2002 Japanese Grudge. I think he just does a lot of interesting things in that I'm kind of with you all on seeing it the first time. I was like, that's it? But seeing it again, it's like, I do enjoy this. Like, I do think it gets stronger when you revisit it. But personally, like, this is just going to kind of segue into next week, but I think one of the scariest scenes in film history is in Kiyoshi Kurosawa's film Pulse, when the guy goes into a room, there's a ghost in there. It starts walking towards him. It doesn't touch him. It just like gets in his face. That to me is terrifying. And I think Shimizu does a good job of that in The Grudge, with just like it's uncomfortable with these ghosts. Like, oh, look, there's a bloody woman. Like, oh, like she's lizard crawling down the stairs and making slither noises. Like, I don't like that. Like, so I think it has some great moments, but as a whole, I do wish it was a little stronger. I'll say that. Bennett, you are on the clock. You got to run in a minute. We are talking next week about Kiyoshi Kurosawa. We're going to be talking about the films Cure and Daguerreotype. We're just going in alphabetical order. Bennett, you want to just give us a quick intro to things to look forward to next week?
Yeah, if you like slow-moving ghosts, let me tell you, Daguerreotype has a very, very slow-moving ghost.
Well, you have to be slow to be captured in a daguerreotype.
Yes, exactly. Well, I didn't even think about it, that it's probably moving at the speed of like the photo processing. Yeah. Interesting. A little preview of next week's discussion. And Cure is really just a scary, upsetting, really bleak movie that you can watch on the Criterion Channel if you've got it. And I'm sure it's rentable elsewhere. So folks, make sure to watch your Kiyoshi Kurosawa films in preparation for what's sure to be a great discussion next week.
So that's going to be next week. We'll also be joined by Lucille Parker. She plays bass in my country band. She is a ton of fun. Any closing thoughts on The Grudge before we call it a day? You got everything out of your system?
Folks, conventional wisdom, there's nothing particularly wise about most conventional wisdom. Am I right, folks? And I think that's definitely the case when one looks at the reception of 2020's The Grudge, now also called The Grudge, The Untold Chapter.
Even that's
give
dumb.
it a shot. That's really fucking dumb, but I like that. That's
Wait,
the
is that they
like,
changed the title?
They
movies.
renamed it.
They released.
I
it
thought
for
you were
home
just
media
saying that
with a new name. No, it's like a live die repeat situation. If you bought the movie, you bought The Grudge, the Untold Chapters.
Wow.
Chapter singular. Yeah. Anyway, folks, give it a shot.
Frankie, any departing words of wisdom?
No.
No. Perfect.
Skip these movies. Don't watch them. Listen, things to like in other movies that are better.
I think if you watch any of them without having watched the other ones, you're going to have a good time.
That's fair. And on that note, why don't we call it a day?
I wouldn't watch all three.
No, you don't need to do that, for sure. All right. Well, thank you for listening. I know it's been a while since we've recorded, but, we're back. We're wading into the horror. Year 5 of October Horror is underway. It's going strong. It will be all month. And if you made it this far in the episode, feel free to leave a SoundCloud comment. Let us know what some of your favorite Japanese horror films are. There are so many great ones, so let's just keep this thing rolling. We're going to be back with Kurosawa next week. Bennett, Frankie, Jim, as always, thank you for joining. This was a ton of fun.
Yeah.
Hey, keep it spooky.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
That is all we've got for today, so thank you, and we'll be back shortly.